She mocked the human soldier, but the alien princess never expected him to walk away. The grand diplomatic hall of the Velithari Empire stretched for nearly a kilometer, its crystalline walls catching the light of 3 distant suns and scattering rainbows across the gathered dignitaries from 100 different worlds. Sergeant Kang Daejun stood at attention near the eastern entrance, his dress uniform crisp and his expression calm as he watched the flowing crowd of alien nobles and diplomats move through the vast space like colorful fish in an endless ocean. He was one of 12 human soldiers assigned to security detail for this historic summit between the Galactic Coalition and the mighty Velithari Empire. And he took his duties seriously, even though most of the aliens in attendance barely acknowledged his existence. The Velithari were tall and elegant creatures, with skin that shimmered like polished silver and eyes that glowed with inner light in shades of purple and gold. And they moved through their own hall with the absolute confidence of a species that had never known defeat. In 10,000 years of recorded history, humanity had only joined the Galactic Coalition 3 decades ago, and most species still considered them primitive newcomers, barely worthy of attention. But the Coalition valued human soldiers for their unexpected resilience and their strange willingness to fight for causes that offered them no personal benefit. Daejun had served for 15 years, and he had learned to ignore the whispers and the looks of contempt that followed humans wherever they went among the stars. Tonight would test that patience in ways he never expected. Princess Sevalira, third daughter of the Velithari Emperor, entered the hall with an entourage of attendants and guards, her gown flowing behind her like liquid moonlight, in her expression carrying the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She was considered beautiful even by the standards of her own species, with features so perfect they seemed sculpted rather than born. And she moved through the crowd, expecting every eye to follow her. Most did. She paused near the refreshment tables to speak with a Korthan ambassador, her laughter ringing out like crystal bells. And then her glowing purple eyes swept across the room and landed on the human soldiers standing at their posts. Her lips curled into a smile that held no warmth. "Ambassador," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "I must ask why the Coalition insists on bringing these creatures to formal events." The Korthan ambassador, a stocky being covered in thick blue fur, shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Zavala glided closer to where Daejun stood, her attendants following like shadows, and she stopped directly in front of him with her head tilted in mock curiosity. "Look at this one," she announced to the growing audience of dignitaries who had turned to watch the spectacle. So small and fragile, with skin like uncooked meat and eyes that cannot even see in proper darkness. Daejun remained at attention, his gaze fixed forward, his breathing steady. "Tell me, little creature," Sevalira continued, her voice dripping with amusement, "do humans truly believe they belong among civilized species? Or do you simply not understand how pathetic you appear to the rest of us?" Scattered laughter echoed from some of the assembled aliens, though others watched in uncomfortable silence. "Your kind lives for what? 80 years if you are fortunate." The princess pressed on, circling him slowly like a predator examining prey. "You cannot survive in vacuum. You cannot regenerate lost limbs. You require constant feeding and sleeping. And yet, you carry weapons as if you have any idea how to use them." Daejun's fellow human soldiers had gone rigid with tension, their hands twitching toward sidearms they could not draw without causing an interstellar incident. "I have read about your homeworld," Sevalira said with a theatrical shudder. "A chaotic death trap of extreme temperatures and violent weather and millions of species competing to devour each other. And somehow, you soft little things crawled out of that nightmare and convinced yourselves you deserve to stand among the stars." She leaned closer, her glowing eyes inches from his face, her breath warm against his skin. "You are vermin," she whispered just loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. Tolerated only because the Coalition finds your despisability useful, Defiant finally moved every alien in the vicinity tensed, expecting violence or angry words, or at least some display of wounded pride that they could mock. Instead, Sergeant Kang Daejun calmly reached down and unclipped his ceremonial sidearm from his belt, and he placed it gently on the nearest table with careful precision. Then he straightened, met Princess Sci-Fi's eyes for one brief moment, and bowed his head in a gesture of quiet respect, and then he simply walked away. He moved through the stunned crowd without hurry, his footsteps steady and his shoulders straight, and he did not look back as he exited through the eastern entrance and disappeared into the corridor beyond. The silence that followed stretched for several long seconds. Princess Sci-Fi stood frozen in place, her expression shifting from triumph to confusion to something she could not quite name. Because in all her years of wielding her status like a weapon, she had never encountered a response like this. He had not fought back, which would have given her the satisfaction of destroying him. He had not submitted, which would have confirmed her beliefs about human weakness, had not begged or argued or tried to defend his species with desperate words. He had simply chosen to leave, and somehow that felt like a defeat she did not understand. "Your Highness?" One of her attendants asked carefully. "Shall we have him detained for disrespecting you?" Sci-Fi raised one hand to silence the question, her glowing eyes still fixed on the doorway through which the human had vanished. "No," she said slowly. "No. I want to know more about that one." She turned to her intelligence advisor with an expression that had grown sharp and curious. "Find out everything about him," she commanded. "I want to know who he is, and where he came from, and why he looked at me like I was the one who should be pitied." The advisor bowed and hurried away to fulfill her orders. Princess Sci-Fi remained standing in the center of the grand hall, surrounded by wealth and power and centuries of Velothari superiority. And for the first time in her life, she felt as though she had encountered something she could not simply dismiss. Human soldier had walked away from her, and she needed to understand why. She mocked the human soldier, but the alien princess never expected him to walk away. Observation Deck 7 was quiet at this hour, its vast transparent walls offering an unobstructed view of the stars that stretched endlessly into the black void beyond the station. Sergeant Kang Daejun stood alone near the center of the deck, his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on a distant nebula that glowed in shades of red and gold. Against the darkness, he heard the door open behind him and recognized the soft footsteps of Velothari boots on the metal floor. But he did not turn around. "You came without your guards," he said calmly. "That is either very brave or very foolish." Princess Sci-Fi stopped a few meters away from him, her silver skin reflecting the starlight and her purple eyes studying his back with an intensity that would have made most beings uncomfortable. "I am a warrior princess of the Velothari Empire," she replied. "I do not require guards to speak with a single human, and yet you brought them everywhere else on this station." Sci-Fi felt a flash of irritation at his casual observation, but pushed it aside. She had not come here to argue about security protocols. "I want to know why you walked away," she demanded. "In the diplomatic hall when I spoke to you. When I said those things, you simply left." Daejun finally turned to face her, and his expression held no anger or resentment, only a quiet patience that she found strangely unsettling. "What would you have preferred?" he asked. "A response?" Sci-Fi said sharply. "Any response at all would have made sense to me, because you could have challenged me to a duel or reported my words to your superiors, or at least defended your species with some argument. Would any of those things have changed your mind about humans?" The question caught her off guard, and she hesitated before answering. "No," she admitted reluctantly. "Probably not. then why would I waste my energy on them? Sci-Fi stepped closer, her frustration building as she searched his face for some sign of hidden emotion, because that is what beings do when they are insulted. She pressed. They fight or they submit. Those are the only choices that make sense. But you did neither, and I cannot understand it. Daejun turned back toward the stars, and when he spoke his voice was soft and distant. I have fought in wars, Princess, and I have lost friends and family and pieces of myself that I will never get back. And I have seen what happens when pride and anger drive our choices. He paused, and Sci-Fi found herself leaning forward to hear his next words. Your insults in that hall were just words. He continued, and words cannot wound me because I have already survived far worse things than a princess who thinks she understands strength. You think I do not understand strength? Sci-Fi demanded, her voice rising. My people have conquered 100 worlds and never known defeat in 10,000 years. And in all that time, how many enemies have you made? Daejun asked quietly. How many species in this galaxy hate the Velathari and dream of the day when they can repay your conquest with blood? Sci-Fi opened her mouth to respond, but found she had no answer. Humanity has been among the stars for only 30 years, Daejun said. And already we have more allies than enemies, because we learned something that your people never had to learn. What is that? That true strength is not about domination, he said, turning to meet her eyes again. It is about knowing when to hold your hand and when to extend it in friendship. That sounds like the philosophy of a species too weak to fight, Sci-Fi said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Perhaps, Daejun acknowledged with a slight nod. Or perhaps it is the philosophy of a species that has seen enough death to know that there must be a better way. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small holographic projector. And when he activated it, the image of a young girl appeared floating in the air between them. This was my sister, he said quietly. Her name was Minji, and she was 12 years old when the Raxians killed her along with my parents. Sci-Fi stared at the smiling face of the human child, frozen forever in that moment of captured happiness. I used to dream about revenge, Daejun continued. I used to imagine finding every Raxian responsible for her death and making them suffer the way she suffered. And that anger kept me alive. Through the darkest years of my life. What happened to that anger? Sci-Fi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I realized that Minji would have hated the person I was becoming, Daejun said, and he deactivated the projector and returned it to his pocket. She was kind and gentle, and she believed that everyone deserved a chance to be better. And if I let my anger turn me into a monster, then the Raxians would have killed her twice. He looked at Sci-Fi with eyes that held no judgment, only a sad wisdom earned through years of pain. You wanted me to fight or submit in that hall, he said. But I chose a third option because fighting you would have meant letting your words have power over me, and submitting would have meant agreeing that you were right about humanity. So you walked away. I chose peace, Daejun corrected gently. Not for you or for the diplomats watching, but for myself, because I have earned the right to decide what battles are worth fighting, and your opinion of humans is not one of them. Sci-Fi stood in silence for a long moment, processing his words. Everything she had been taught told her that his philosophy was weakness, that mercy was the privilege of those who had never faced true conflict, that only strength through dominance could ensure survival in a hostile galaxy. And yet something in his quiet certainty made her doubt those lessons for the first time in her life. You are not what I expected, she finally said. Neither are you, Daejun replied with the ghost of a smile. Most Velathari would never have come here alone to ask questions they were not sure they wanted answered. Before Sci-Fi could respond, a piercing alarm shattered. The peaceful silence of the observation deck red emergency lights began flashing throughout the station, and a mechanical voice announced words that made both of them freeze in place. Warning. Hostile forces have breached the station. All personnel report to emergency stations immediately. Dechun's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His calm, patience replaced by sharp focus as he drew his sidearm and moved toward the exit. "Stay close to me, Princess," he said without looking back. "It seems our conversation will have to wait." She mocked the human soldier, but the alien princess never expected him to walk away 3 days after the incident in the diplomatic hall. Princess Sci-Fi sat alone in her private intelligence chamber, surrounded by floating holographic displays that cast pale blue light across her silver features. The dossier on Sergeant Kang Dae-jun was far more extensive than she had expected. And the more she read, the less she understood. "Computer," she commanded, "display homeworld data for the human species." The holographic screens shifted to show a blue and green planet orbiting a yellow star at the edge of the galaxy. And beside it scrolled endless streams of environmental data that made Sci-Fi's eyes narrow in disbelief. Earth. Humans called their world Earth. And according to every scientific analysis in the Coalition database, it should not have produced intelligent life at all. The planet experienced temperature variations of over 100 degrees depending on location and season, and its atmosphere carried violent storms capable of leveling cities. And its oceans rose and fell with crushing force against every coastline. "This cannot be accurate," Sci-Fi muttered as she scrolled through the data. Earthquakes shook the ground without warning, and volcanoes erupted with enough force to alter the climate for years. And the planet hosted millions of species locked in. Constant competition for survival through predation and parasitism and disease. The Velithari homeworld was a carefully managed paradise where every variable had been controlled for millennia. And the idea that sentient beings could evolve on a planet that seemed actively hostile to life struck her as absurd. And yet the humans had not merely survived on this death world, they had thrived, they had spread across every continent and adapted to every climate and eventually clawed their way into space. Through sheer stubborn determination. "Show me the file on Sergeant Kang specifically." Sci-Fi ordered. The display shifted again, and a younger version of the human soldier appeared before her. His military identification photograph, showing a face that had not yet learned the careful blankness she had seen in the diplomatic hall. Born in a coastal city called Bizen on the Korean peninsula, Kang Dae-jun had lost his entire family during the First Contact War when he was only 14 years old. Sci-Fi leaned forward as she read the details. The Raxian Dominion had been the first alien species to discover humanity. And instead of offering peaceful contact, they had decided that Earth would make an excellent colony world once the native infestation was removed. The war lasted 4 years. 4 years of orbital bombardments and ground invasions and desperate human resistance against an enemy with superior technology and greater numbers. And somehow the humans had refused to surrender, even when every logical analysis said they should. The Raxians had expected easy conquest and instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare of guerrilla warfare and improvised weapons and enemy that simply would not stop fighting no matter how many of them died. When the Galactic Coalition finally intervened and forced a ceasefire, the Raxians had lost more soldiers on Earth than in any other campaign in their history, and Kang Dae-jun had been one of the survivors. Sci-Fi read about how his parents and younger sister had died when Raxian forces destroyed their neighborhood, and how the teenage boy had joined a civilian resistance cell and fought for 2 years before the war ended, and how he had enlisted in the newly formed Human Defense Force on his 18th birthday. His service record was impressive by any species standards. He had served in the frontier campaigns against Raxian remnant forces for nearly a decade, and he had been wounded 7 times and decorated for valor 4 times. and he had risen through the ranks on merit alone. But one incident in particular caught Sci-Fi's attention during the Battle of Epsilon Outpost. Sergeant Kang's unit had captured a Raxian officer named Commander Thexis, a veteran who had personally ordered attacks on human civilian populations during the First Contact Warby, all rights of Velithari law. Kang Daejun had earned the privilege of blood vengeance. He had lost everything to the Raxians, and here before him knelt one of the beings responsible for that loss. And no one in the galaxy would have blamed him for taking the commander's life. He did not. The file included a transcript of the official inquiry that followed, and Sci-Fi read Kang's words with growing confusion. "Why did you spare the prisoner?" The inquiry officer had asked. "Killing him would not bring my family back," Kang had answered, "and it would not undo the suffering he caused, and it would not make the galaxy a better place. You had every right to execute him under the rules of engagement. Having the right to do something does not make it the right thing to do." Kang had replied, "Commander Thexis will spend the rest of his life knowing what he did, and living with that knowledge is punishment enough." Sci-Fi sat back in her chair and stared at the holographic text floating before her. She had been raised in a culture that valued strength above all else. And strength meant dominance, and dominance meant crushing your enemies without mercy. And any sign of compassion toward a defeated foe was considered weakness. Of the most shameful kind, the Velithari did not forgive the Velithari did not forget, and they certainly did not spare enemies who had harmed their families. Yet here was this human, this small and fragile creature from a death world, who had looked at the being responsible for his family's murder and chosen mercy. It made no sense. "Computer," Sci-Fi said slowly, "locate the current position of Sergeant Kang Daejun." The human designated Kang. "Daejun is currently stationed on observation. Deck 7, the computer." Resplendent Zavella rose from her chair with sudden decision. She had spent 3 days studying this human through files and reports and data streams, and she was no closer to understanding him than she had been in the diplomatic hall when he walked away from her insults without a word. If she wanted answers, she would have to ask him directly. She dismissed her guards with a wave of her hand, ignoring their protests about security protocols, and she made her way through the winding corridors of the diplomatic station toward Observation Deck 7. The Princess of the Velithari Empire was going to have a conversation with a human soldier, and she was not entirely sure what she hoped to learn. She mocked the human soldier, but the alien princess never expected him to walk away. The corridors of the diplomatic station had transformed into a nightmare of flashing lights and screaming, alarms and the distant sounds of weapons fire echoing through metal, while Sergeant Kang Daejun moved through the chaos, with Princess Sci-Fi close behind him, his sidearm raised and his senses alert for any sign of the enemy forces that had breached the station's defenses. Who would dare attack a coalition diplomatic station? Sci-Fi demanded as they pressed against a wall to avoid a group of panicked delegates running past. The emergency broadcast mentioned Raxian signatures, Daejun replied grimly. Probably remnant forces hoping to disrupt the summit and kill as many high-value targets as possible. Raxians, Sci-Fi repeated with disgust. Those creatures are nothing but vermin. Daejun did not respond to her comment, but something flickered in his eyes that she did not understand. They reached an intersection where 3 corridors met, and Daejun held up his hand to signal a stop as he listened carefully to the sounds around them. "Your personal quarters are in the East Wing," he said quietly. "If we can reach them, you will have access to your guards and your own security systems. Why are you helping me?" Sci-Fi asked suddenly. "After everything I said about humans, about you specifically, why would you risk your life to protect me?" "Because protecting people is my job," Daejun answered simply. And because what you said in that hall does not change what is right. Before Sci could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor ahead of them, and 3 armored figures stepped into view with weapons raised. Rakshanchi were tall and insectoid, with chitinous exoskeletons of dark red and multiple limbs that moved with disturbing coordination, and their compound eyes fixed on Princess Sci with unmistakable recognition. The Velathari princess. One of them hissed in accented common. Our commander will pay well for her head. Daejun stepped forward without hesitation, placing himself between Sci and the assassins. You will have to go through me first, he said calmly. The lead Raxian made a sound that might have been laughter. A single human against 3 Raxian warriors? It mocked. This will be over before it begins. You would be surprised what a single human can do, Daejun replied. And then he muttered Zavella had seen Velathari warriors train since she was a child, and she had always believed her people were the finest fighters in the galaxy. But watching the human soldier attack made her realize how wrong that assumption had been. He was not elegant or graceful like Velathari warriors. He was brutal and efficient and utterly relentless. His first shot took the lead Raxian in one of its primary eyes, and before the creature could even scream, he had closed the distance and driven his combat knife into the gap between its head and thorax with precise knowledge of Raxian anatomy. The second Raxian swung a bladed limb at his head, and Daejun ducked beneath it, rolling forward and coming up inside the creature's guard, where its longer reach became a disadvantage. His knife found vital organs twice in rapid succession, and the Raxian collapsed with a wet gurgling sound. The third assassin was faster and more skilled than its companions, and its counterattack caught Daejun across the ribs with a slash that sent dark blood spraying across the corridor wall. He staggered but did not fall, and when the Raxian pressed its advantage, he caught its striking limb with his free hand and used its own momentum to pull it off balance. The knife rose and fell 3 times, and then the corridor was silent except for Daechun's heavy breathing and the distant wail of emergency alarm. Shivala stared at the 3 dead Raxians lying at her feet, and then at the human soldier who had killed them in less than 30 seconds. Blood was running freely from the wound in his side, and his face had gone pale with pain and exertion. But his eyes were still sharp and alert as he scanned the corridor for additional threats. We need to move, he said, his voice strained but steady. Where there are 3, there will be more. You are injured, Sci protested. You need medical attention. I need to get you to safety first, Daejun replied. And he began moving again before she could argue. They made it another 50 meters before a second group of Raxians appeared. This time, 5 of them blocking the corridor that led to the east wing. Daejun raised his sidearm but swayed on his feet, and Sci realized with growing horror that he was losing too much blood to fight effectively. Get behind me, he said anyway, his weapon trained on the approaching enemies. You cannot defeat 5 of them in your condition, Sci hissed. Maybe not, Daejun admitted quietly, but I can slow them down long enough for you to run. I will not flee like a coward while you die for me. Daejun glanced back at her with an expression that might have been a smile. It is not cowardice to survive, Princess, and someone needs to tell the coalition what happened here. He fired twice before the Raxians charged, dropping one of them with shots to its center mass. And then they were on him in a storm of bladed limbs, and chitinous Forest of Valor watched in horrified fascination as the wounded human fought with everything he had, taking injuries that would have killed a Velathari warrior 3 times over, but refusing to stop moving, refusing to fall, refusing to let even one of the assassins past him to reach her. He killed 2 more before a savage blow to his leg brought him to his knees, and he killed another one from the ground before the last Raxian standing raised its blade for a killing strike. Savellara moved without thinking her Hand closed around the knife Dejun had dropped, and she drove it into the Raxian's back with all the strength her warrior training had given her, twisting the blade until the creature shrieked and collapsed. Then there was silence. Dejun lay on the floor surrounded by dead Raxians, his body torn and bleeding from wounds too numerous to count, and his eyes found Sci-Fi standing over him with his bloody knife still clutched in her hand. "Nice thrust," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "Why?" Sci-Fi demanded, dropping to her knees beside him. "Why did you do this for me after everything I said?" Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth as he tried to answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply, and then his eyes closed. Isabella screamed for medics with a desperation she had never felt before, her hands pressing against his wounds in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. And she refused to move even when coalition security forces finally arrived to secure the corridor. She stayed beside the unconscious human soldier until the medical team came. And when they lifted him onto a stretcher, she followed them all the way to the emergency medical bay. The princess of the Velathari Empire was not going to let this human die, not if she could help it. She mocked the human soldier, but the alien princess never expected him to walk away 5 days after the attack on the diplomatic station. Sergeant Kang Dejun opened his eyes in the soft blue glow of the medical bay and found Princess of Alira sitting in a chair beside his bed. She looked different than he remembered. The arrogant tilt of her chin was gone, replaced by something softer and more uncertain, and her glowing purple eyes watched him with an expression that held no trace of the contempt she had shown in the diplomatic hall. "You are awake," she said quietly, and there was relief in her voice that surprised them both. Dejun tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his body from a dozen different wounds. "Easy," Sci-Fi warned, rising from her chair to gently push him back against the pillows. "The doctor said you are lucky to be alive after losing that much blood. Humans are stubborn," Dejun managed with a weak smile. "We do not die easily, so I have learned." She returned to her chair and sat in silence for a moment, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "I came to apologize," she finally said. "Not because protocol demands it or because my father expects it, but because I was wrong about you and your species and everything. I thought I understood about strength." Dejun watched her without speaking, giving her the space to find her words. "The Velathari believe that power comes from dominance," Sci-Fi continued. "We are taught from birth that mercy is weakness and compassion is foolishness, and the only way to survive in this galaxy is to crush anyone who threatens us before they can become a danger." She paused and took a shaky breath. "I watched you fight those Raxians, and you were terrifying in a way I have never seen before. But that was not what changed my mind about humans." "What did?" Dejun asked softly. "The way you looked at me when I asked why you were protecting me," Sci-Fi answered, and her voice trembled slightly. "You said it was because protecting people was your job, and because doing the right thing mattered more than anything. I had said to hurt you." She finally met his eyes, and he was startled to see moisture gathering in them. "No Velathari warrior would have done that," she admitted. "If I had insulted one of my own people the way I insulted you, they would have let me die and called it justice. But you nearly gave your life for someone who had treated you with nothing but cruelty." "You are not cruel," Dejun said gently. "You were raised in a culture that taught you certain things about the galaxy, and you believed what you were taught because why would you not? That does not excuse what I said." "No," he agreed, "but it explains it. And understanding why someone does something wrong is the first step toward forgiving them." Sci-Fi stared at him with an expression of pure bewilderment. "How can you forgive so easily?" she demanded. "After everything my people have done to look down on humans, after everything I said to you personally, how can you just let it go?" Dejun reached into the small bag of personal effects on the table beside his bed. and pulled out the holographic projector he had shown her on the observation deck, because my sister taught me that holding on to anger only hurts the person carrying it, he said as the image of Minji flickered to life between them. And because I believe that anyone can learn to be better if they are given the chance. He deactivated the projector and looked at Sci-Fi with eyes that held no judgment. You came here to apologize without your guards and without your titles protecting you, he said. That tells me you have already started learning. 3 days later, the diplomatic summit reconvened in the Grand Hall that had been repaired after the Raxian attack, and representatives from every species in the Galactic Coalition gathered to witness the closing ceremonies. Princess Sci-Fi stood at the central podium with her father, the Emperor, watching from his throne, and the eyes of 100 worlds focused on her elegant silver features. Before we conclude this summit, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space, I wish to speak about an injustice that occurred in this very hall. Murmurs rippled through the assembled dignitaries. Many of you witnessed me mock and belittle the human soldiers assigned to protect this gathering. Sci-Fi continued, I called them weak and pathetic and unworthy of standing among civilized species. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the crowd until it found Sergeant Kang Daejun standing at his post near the eastern entrance. I was wrong. Shocked silence fell over the hall. Sergeant Kang Daejun of the Human Defense Force saved my life during the recent attack, Sci-Fi declared. He fought against impossible odds and sustained injuries that would have killed most beings in this room. And he did so without hesitation, despite the insults I had heaped upon him and his people. She stepped down from the podium and walked through the crowd toward Daejun, and every eye in the hall followed her. When I asked him why he protected me after everything I had said, do you know what he told me? She asked the assembly. He said it was the right thing to do. She stopped in front of Daejun and held out her hand in the human gesture of respect she had researched specifically for this moment. Humans have a saying that I have come to understand, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. They say that true strength is knowing when to hold your hand. And Sergeant Kang has shown me what that truly means. Daejun hesitated for only a moment before accepting her handshake, and the hall erupted in a mixture of shocked whispers and cautious applause. The Velathari Empire owes this human a debt, Sci-Fi announced, and I personally owe him my life. Which is why I am recommending to my father that we revise our assessment of humanity's place in the galactic community. She turned back to face the crowd. They are not weak, she declared firmly. They are simply strong in ways we did not understand. The ceremony concluded an hour later, and as the dignitaries filed out of the hall to return to their ships and their homeworlds, a young human soldier approached Sergeant Kang at his post. That was quite a speech the princess gave, the soldier said with barely contained excitement. Everyone is talking about it, and the news channels are saying it might actually change how the coalition treats humans. Daejun simply nodded. Does it mean anything to you? The soldier pressed. Having a Velathari princess publicly apologize and call you a hero in front of the entire galaxy? Daejun considered the question for a moment. Words are just words, he said finally. Actions matter. He straightened his uniform and prepared to return to his regular duties. The duties that had defined his life since he was 18 years old. The duties that asked nothing of him except that he do what was right regardless of recognition or reward. Across the hall, Princess Sci-Fi paused at the exit and looked back at the human soldier who had changed everything she thought she knew about strength and weakness. He stood at attention, as he always did, unchanged by fame or praise. Simply doing his job, and she finally understood true strength was not about domination or conquest or crushing your enemies beneath your heel. Strength was about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, showing mercy when vengeance would be justified, and walking away from insults that did not deserve the dignity of a response Kang. Daejun had tried to teach her that on the observation deck, but she had not truly understood until she watched him nearly die to protect someone who had given him no reason for loyalty. She understood now, and as she turned to leave the hall and return to her empire with lessons she had never expected to learn, Princess Sci-Fi made a silent promise to herself. She would be better, she would be stronger, she would be human.